Picture this. A 20-year-old prince stands over his father's bloodied corpse, assassinated at his own daughter's wedding. The kingdom teeters on the edge of collapse, rebellions spark across the empire, enemy armies mass at the borders, most would flee, most would hide. But this young man, he doesn't just survive the chaos, he transforms it into the greatest conquest in human history. In just 13 years, he will march his armies across 3 continents, defeat every enemy who dares face him, and build an empire stretching from Greece to India. His name will echo through eternity, Alexander the Great. But how does a teenager become the master of the known world before his 30th birthday? Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because YouTube's algorithm is more unpredictable than Alexander's battle tactics, and you might never find us again without that notification bell. The story begins not with Alexander, but with his father, Philip II of Macedon. In 359 BCE, Macedonia was considered a backwater kingdom by the sophisticated Greeks to the south. The Athenians called Macedonians barbarians. The Spartans dismissed them as irrelevant. But Philip had a vision that would reshape the ancient world. He understood something his contemporaries missed. Warfare was evolving, and whoever adapted first would dominate everyone else. Philip revolutionized military technology and tactics. He created the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers armed with 18-foot spears called sarissas. These weapons were nearly twice as long as traditional Greek spears, giving Macedonian infantry a devastating reach advantage. But Philip's genius went beyond equipment. He professionalized his army, paying soldiers year-round rather than relying on seasonal farmers. He integrated cavalry, infantry, and siege engines into a coordinated fighting machine. Most importantly, he understood that conquering territory meant nothing if you couldn't hold it. So he developed sophisticated diplomatic and administrative systems to manage his expanding kingdom. By the time Alexander was born in 356 BCE, Philip had already begun transforming Macedonia from a minor kingdom into a regional power. But Alexander's birth was surrounded by omens that suggested this child was destined for something extraordinary. Legend says that on the night of his birth, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The magicians declared that this was because the goddess herself had left her temple to attend Alexander's birth. Whether you believe in omens or not, Alexander's upbringing was certainly extraordinary. Philip ensured his son received the finest education available. When Alexander was 13, Philip hired Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, as his personal tutor. For 3 years, Aristotle taught Alexander not just philosophy and rhetoric, but also medicine, literature, and natural sciences. This wasn't typical royal education. This was creating a mind capable of understanding and ruling diverse cultures across vast distances. But Aristotle's influence went deeper than academics. He taught Alexander that different peoples had different customs and beliefs, and that effective leadership required understanding and respecting these differences. This lesson would prove crucial when Alexander later governed an empire spanning dozens of cultures and languages. Aristotle also instilled in Alexander a love of Homer's Iliad, particularly the character of Achilles. Alexander would carry a copy of the Iliad throughout his campaigns, sleeping with it under his pillow. He saw himself as a new Achilles, destined for glory even if it meant an early death. Meanwhile, Philip continued his military campaigns, gradually bringing the Greek city-states under Macedonian control. The defining moment came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip's army decisively defeated a coalition of Greek forces led by Athens and Thebes. 18-year-old Alexander commanded the cavalry in this battle, leading the charge that broke the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit that had never been defeated. The victory at Chaeronea established Macedonia as the dominant power in Greece and marked Alexander's emergence as a military commander in his own right. With Greece subdued, Philip began planning the ultimate campaign, an invasion of the Persian Empire. For over a century, the Persians had been the greatest power in the known world, ruling territory from modern-day Turkey to India. Greek city-states had fought numerous wars against Persia, with mixed results. Philip saw an opportunity to unite the Greeks under Macedonian leadership and finally defeat their common enemy. He sent advance forces across the Hellespont into Asia Minor and began assembling the largest army Greece had ever seen. But Philip would never lead this campaign. In 336 BCE, at his daughter's wedding, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, Pausanias. The exact motive remains debated by historians. Some suggest it was a personal vendetta. Pausanias had been sexually assaulted by one of Philip's associates, and Philip had refused to provide justice. Others suspect a broader conspiracy, possibly involving Alexander's mother, Olympias, who had been displaced as Philip's primary wife. Whatever the truth, Philip's death threw Macedonia into crisis. Alexander was just 20 years old when he inherited the throne, and his position was far from secure. Several of Philip's generals commanded more respect among the troops. The Greek city-states, seeing an opportunity, began rebelling against Macedonian rule. Northern tribes threatened Macedonia's borders. Many expected the young king to spend years consolidating power at home, if he survived at all. Instead, Alexander moved with lightning speed that would characterize his entire reign. He immediately secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army by promising to continue Philip's Persian campaign and distribute the spoils of war among the soldiers. He executed or exiled potential rivals within the court. Most dramatically, when the city of Thebes rebelled and declared independence, Alexander marched south with incredible speed and completely destroyed the city, selling the survivors into slavery. This brutal demonstration sent a clear message to other Greek cities: submit or face annihilation. The destruction of Thebes shocked the ancient world. This wasn't just military conquest, it was the complete erasure of a city that had existed for centuries. The psychological impact was enormous. Other Greek cities quickly submitted rather than risk similar destruction. Athens, despite its hatred of Macedonian rule, sent ambassadors to pledge loyalty. In a single campaign, Alexander had not only secured his southern flank, but established his reputation as a leader who would use whatever force necessary to achieve his goals. With Greece secured, Alexander could finally turn his attention to Philip's grand plan, the conquest of Persia. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with an army of approximately 35,000 men. This force was relatively small by Persian standards. The Persian Empire could theoretically field armies of hundreds of thousands, but it was the most professional and well-trained military force of its time. Every soldier was equipped with the finest weapons and armor. The cavalry was composed of Macedonian nobles who had trained together since childhood. The infantry phalanx was a precision instrument honed by years of Philip's reforms. But Alexander's greatest advantage wasn't numerical or technological. It was strategic and psychological. He understood that the Persian Empire, despite its vast size, was fundamentally unstable. It was a collection of conquered peoples held together by imperial administration rather than shared culture or loyalty. Many Persian subjects had been conquered relatively recently and harbored resentment against their rulers. Local governors often prioritized their own interests over imperial policy. If Alexander could win a few decisive victories and present himself as a liberator rather than just another conqueror, he could potentially turn the empire's size against itself. Alexander's first major test came at the Battle of Granicus River. A Persian force led by several satraps, provincial governors, and reinforced by Greek mercenaries attempted to stop the Macedonian invasion at the river crossing. On paper, the Persians had several advantages. They held the high ground, they knew the terrain, and they had roughly equal numbers. But Alexander had something the Persians didn't expect. He was willing to lead from the front. When his generals suggested waiting or finding another crossing, Alexander rejected their caution. He personally led the cavalry charge across the river, directly into the enemy line. This wasn't just brave, it was brilliant psychology. Alexander's willingness to share the dangers faced by his soldiers created an unbreakable bond between commander and army. His men would follow him anywhere because they knew he would never ask them to face risks he wouldn't face himself. The charge across the Granicus was nearly fatal. Alexander's helmet was shattered by a Persian battle axe, and he was saved only when his friend Clytus the Black killed his attacker. But the psychological impact of seeing their king fighting in the front ranks inspired the Macedonian forces to fight with extraordinary ferocity. The Persian line broke, and their forces scattered in retreat. Alexander had won his first major victory in Asia, and crucially, he captured the Persian war chest that had been prepared to fund the defense of Asia Minor. After Granicus, Alexander's strategy became clear. Rather than simply conquering territory, he was systematically dismantling the Persian Empire's ability to resist. He captured or destroyed Persian strongholds, recruited local populations to his cause, and most importantly, cut off Persian access to their greatest advantage: wealth. The Persian Empire was built on tribute flowing from conquered territories to the imperial center. By controlling these territories, Alexander was simultaneously strengthening his own forces and weakening his enemies. Alexander's treatment of conquered peoples was revolutionary for its time. Unlike typical ancient conquerors who simply imposed their will through force, Alexander adapted his approach to local customs and expectations. In Asia Minor, he presented himself as a liberator, freeing Greek cities from Persian rule. He restored democratic governments that the Persians had replaced with friendly tyrants. He reduced or eliminated the tribute payments that cities had been forced to pay to Persia. This wasn't just good public relations, it was practical politics. Cities that welcomed Alexander as a liberator were far less likely to rebel when he moved on to his next conquest. But Alexander's most audacious move came when he reached the ancient city of Troy. Here, he performed elaborate sacrifices to Achilles and declared himself the successor to the legendary Greek heroes who had fought in the Trojan War. This wasn't mere theater. It was sophisticated propaganda aimed at multiple audiences. To his Greek allies, it reinforced the idea that this campaign was the culmination of the ancient Greek struggle against Eastern barbarians. To his Macedonian soldiers, it connected their current campaign to the greatest military adventure in Greek literature. To potential Persian subjects, it demonstrated that Alexander commanded the same divine favor that had allowed the Greeks to conquer Troy. As Alexander moved south along the coast of Asia Minor, he faced increasingly difficult strategic decisions. The Persian king, Darius III, was assembling a massive army in Syria. Alexander could either continue his methodical conquest of coastal cities, ensuring secure supply lines but giving Darius time to prepare, or he could march inland immediately and force a decisive battle. Characteristically, Alexander chose the aggressive option. But first, he had to deal with one of the most challenging sieges of his career, the city of Halicarnassus. This fortress was defended by Memnon of Rhodes, the most capable Greek mercenary commander in Persian service. Memnon understood Alexander's strengths and weaknesses better than any Persian general. He knew that Alexander's army, while formidable in open battle, was relatively small and dependent on continuous success to maintain morale. A prolonged siege could bog down the Macedonian advance and give Darius time to prepare his defenses. The siege of Halicarnassus lasted for months and demonstrated both Alexander's military brilliance and his ruthless pragmatism. When direct assault failed, he ordered the construction of massive siege engines, including towers taller than the city walls and catapults capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. When the defenders managed to destroy several of these engines in night raids, Alexander personally led counterattacks to capture the raiders. The siege became a battle of engineering and logistics as much as military tactics. Eventually, Alexander's superior resources and relentless pressure forced the defenders to abandon the city, but not before they had inflicted significant casualties on his forces. The siege taught Alexander important lessons about the challenges of conquering fortified positions and the importance of maintaining multiple siege specialists and engineers. These lessons would prove crucial in later campaigns when he faced even more formidable fortifications. With the Aegean coast secured, Alexander made one of the most controversial decisions of his campaign. He disbanded his naval forces and sent them home. This move shocked his generals, who argued that Persian naval power could cut off his retreat route and isolate his army in Asia. But Alexander's logic was characteristically bold. He reasoned that maintaining a fleet required enormous resources that could be better used to expand his army. More importantly, he was committing himself and his soldiers to complete victory. By eliminating the possibility of retreat, he was forcing everyone to fight with the desperation of men who had no choice but to win. This decision revealed Alexander's understanding of military psychology. Armies with easy escape routes often break and run when faced with serious opposition. Armies with no escape fight to the death. By burning his bridges, literally and figuratively, Alexander was ensuring that his soldiers would give everything they had in every battle. It was an enormous risk, but it was also a demonstration of the confidence that made his soldiers believe they were truly invincible. As Alexander moved inland, he received disturbing news. Darius III was approaching with an army that vastly outnumbered the Macedonian forces. Estimates of Darius's army size vary wildly in ancient sources, with some claiming over 1 million men. But modern historians suggest it was probably around 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers. Even at the lower estimate, Alexander was outnumbered by at least 3 to 1, and possibly much more. The armies met at Issus, a narrow coastal plain that would become the site of one of history's most decisive battles. The location was crucial because it limited Darius's ability to use his numerical advantage. In open terrain, the Persian army could have surrounded and overwhelmed the Macedonians through sheer numbers. But at Issus, the narrow battlefield meant that only a fraction of the Persian forces could engage at any given time. Alexander's tactical brilliance shone at Issus. He positioned his army with the sea on one flank and mountains on the other, making it impossible for the Persians to outflank him. He placed his strongest units, the companion cavalry, on the right wing, where he personally commanded them. The phalanx held the center, their long sarissas creating an impenetrable wall of spear points. On the left wing, he positioned his Greek allied cavalry and lighter infantry, with orders to hold their ground rather than attack. The battle began with Alexander personally leading a cavalry charge directly at Darius's position in the Persian center. This wasn't just tactically sound, it was psychologically devastating. The sight of the Macedonian king leading a direct assault on the Persian emperor created panic in the Persian ranks. Soldiers who had been prepared to fight against enemy units suddenly found themselves facing a legendary warrior king who seemed to appear wherever the fighting was fiercest. Darius, faced with Alexander's direct assault and seeing his guards falling around him, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He fled the battlefield. The Persian emperor's retreat was visible to much of his army, and it created a cascade of panic and confusion. Units that had been holding their ground suddenly found themselves wondering whether they should continue fighting or follow their emperor's example. Alexander's victory at Issus was complete and devastating. The Persian army didn't just lose, it disintegrated. Thousands of Persian soldiers were killed or captured, while Macedonian casualties were relatively light. More importantly, Alexander captured Darius's entire royal household, including his mother, wife, and children. This gave him enormous diplomatic leverage and allowed him to present himself as the rightful successor to Persian imperial authority. But Alexander's treatment of his royal prisoners was as important as his military victory. Instead of executing them or holding them in harsh conditions, he treated them with honor and respect, befitting their royal status. Darius's mother, Gambis, was particularly impressed by Alexander's courtesy and eventually came to regard him as a son. This wasn't just personal kindness, it was sophisticated political strategy. By demonstrating that he respected Persian royal traditions, Alexander was signaling to Persian nobles that they could serve him without losing their dignity or status. The victory at Issus opened up two possible strategic directions for Alexander. He could pursue Darius immediately, potentially ending Persian resistance with a second decisive victory. Alternatively, he could secure his conquests by capturing the remaining Persian strongholds in the eastern Mediterranean, ensuring that no enemy forces remained behind his lines. Once again, Alexander chose the more cautious but ultimately more effective strategy. Alexander's next target was the island city of Tyre, one of the most important commercial centers in the ancient world. Tyre's merchants controlled much of the trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and their wealth funded much of Persia's military capabilities. More importantly, Tyre's location on an island made it virtually impregnable to conventional siege tactics. The city had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries, and its defenders were confident that they could outlast any besieging army. Alexander's response to this challenge was characteristically audacious. If he couldn't reach the island city by sea, he would build a causeway across the water. This was an engineering project of staggering ambition. The causeway would need to be nearly half a mile long, built in water up to 18 feet deep, and strong enough to support siege engines and assault troops. Most generals would have considered such a project impossible. The construction of the causeway took 7 months and required the labor of thousands of workers. Alexander's soldiers cut down entire forests to provide timber, demolished nearby cities to obtain stone, and worked under constant harassment from Tyrian ships and missiles. Alexander himself participated in the construction work, carrying stones and timber alongside his soldiers. This personal involvement was crucial for maintaining morale during the long, difficult project. The Tyrians weren't passive during the siege. They launched numerous attacks on the construction site, using fire ships to try to destroy the causeway and specialized siege engines to bombard the workers. They also sent diplomatic missions to other cities, trying to organize a coalition against Alexander. But the psychological impact of the causeway project was enormous. Cities throughout the region could see that Alexander was willing to literally move heaven and earth to achieve his objectives. When the causeway was finally completed, Alexander had created more than just a military asset. He had demonstrated that traditional defensive strategies were obsolete when facing Macedonian determination and ingenuity. The siege of Tyre established Alexander's reputation as a commander who could overcome any obstacle, no matter how formidable it appeared. The final assault on Tyre was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Alexander attacked from both the causeway and the sea, using ships borrowed from recently conquered cities. Siege engines pounded the walls, while marines attempted to scale them from floating platforms. The fighting was brutal and lasted for days, but eventually Macedonian forces breached the walls and stormed the city. Alexander's treatment of Tyre after its capture was harsh even by ancient standards. He executed thousands of defenders and sold the remaining population into slavery. This severity wasn't simply vengeance, it was a calculated message to other cities considering resistance. The destruction of Tyre demonstrated that cities which submitted to Alexander would be treated generously, while those that resisted would face complete destruction. With Tyre eliminated, Alexander moved south toward Egypt, but first had to deal with another defiant city, Gaza. This fortress controlled the main route between Syria and Egypt, and was defended by a Persian garrison under a commander named Battis. Like Tyre, Gaza was considered virtually impregnable due to its location on a high mound surrounded by desert. The siege of Gaza repeated many of the tactical innovations Alexander had developed at Tyre, but with important refinements. Instead of building a causeway, Alexander's engineers constructed massive earthworks around the entire city, creating a ramp that allowed siege engines to reach the level of the walls. The project took 2 months and again required Alexander's personal participation in the construction work. During the siege, Alexander was seriously wounded by a catapult bolt that pierced his shoulder and penetrated to the bone. His doctors warned that he might never regain full use of his arm, but Alexander refused to halt the siege or delegate command to his generals. He continued to direct operations from his sickbed and insisted on participating in the final assault despite his injury. The capture of Gaza opened the route to Egypt, one of the wealthiest and most important provinces of the Persian Empire. Egypt had been conquered by Persia relatively recently, and many Egyptians still resented Persian rule. Alexander's approach to Egypt demonstrated his growing sophistication as an imperial administrator, rather than just a military conqueror. Instead of imposing Macedonian customs on Egypt, Alexander presented himself as the legitimate pharaoh and heir to Egypt's ancient traditions. He made public sacrifices to Egyptian gods, consulted with Egyptian priests, and respected local customs that previous conquerors had tried to suppress. This approach wasn't just politically astute, it reflected the influence of Aristotle's teachings about the importance of understanding different cultures. Alexander's most famous action in Egypt was his journey to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis. This was a dangerous trip across hundreds of miles of desert to consult with priests who claimed to speak for the god Ammon, whom Greeks identified with Zeus. The purpose of this journey has been debated by historians for centuries. Some suggest Alexander was seeking divine confirmation of his royal status. Others argue he was establishing religious legitimacy for his rule over diverse peoples who might not accept a foreign conqueror but would respect someone chosen by the gods. What happened at Siwa remains one of history's great mysteries. Alexander spoke privately with the oracle's priests and never revealed the full content of their conversation. However, he emerged from the meeting claiming to be the son of Ammon, and therefore divine. This claim would have enormous implications for how Alexander saw himself and how others saw him throughout the rest of his campaign. While in Egypt, Alexander also founded the first of the many cities that would bear his name, Alexandria. The site he chose for this new city demonstrated his strategic brilliance. Located where the Nile River met the Mediterranean Sea, Alexandria would control trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The city would eventually become one of the largest and most important cities in the ancient world, surviving long after Alexander's empire had crumbled. The founding of Alexandria revealed another aspect of Alexander's vision that set him apart from typical conquerors. He wasn't just interested in extracting wealth from conquered territories. He wanted to create lasting institutions that would benefit both conquerors and conquered peoples. Alexandria was designed to be a center of learning and commerce, where Greek, Egyptian, and other cultures could interact and influence each other. After spending the winter of 332 to 331 BCE organizing Egyptian affairs, Alexander was ready to resume his pursuit of Darius. The Persian king had spent the intervening months assembling another massive army, this time in the heartland of the Persian Empire. Ancient sources again provide wildly varying estimates of this army's size, but it was certainly the largest force Darius had ever commanded, possibly including contingents from every corner of the Persian Empire. The two armies met at Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. Unlike Issus, this battlefield was chosen by Darius specifically to maximize his advantages. The terrain was open and flat, perfect for cavalry charges and allowing the full Persian army to deploy. Darius had even had the battlefield prepared by leveling obstacles and clearing stones that might interfere with his scythed chariots. The Battle of Gaugamela was the climactic confrontation between the Greek and Persian worlds. On one side stood Alexander with approximately 47,000 men, the survivors of 4 years of constant campaigning, supplemented by reinforcements from Macedonia and Greece. On the other side was Darius, with possibly 250,000 soldiers, representing the full might of the Persian Empire. This wasn't just a battle between two armies. It was the collision of two civilizations. Alexander's tactical plan for Gaugamela was his most sophisticated yet. Recognizing that he was vastly outnumbered, he couldn't afford a straightforward battle of attrition. Instead, he designed a strategy to use the Persians' numerical advantage against them. He positioned his army in an unconventional formation, with strong flanking forces angled back from the main line. This created gaps in his formation that appeared to be weaknesses but were actually traps. The battle began with a Persian cavalry charge aimed at Alexander's right flank. Instead of meeting this charge head-on, Alexander ordered a fighting retreat that drew the Persian cavalry away from the main Persian line. Meanwhile, Darius launched his scythed chariots at the Macedonian center. These weapons, designed to break up infantry formations, were neutralized by Alexander's light troops, who had been trained specifically to deal with this threat. As the Persian attacks developed, gaps began to appear in their line as units moved to exploit apparent Macedonian weaknesses. Alexander had been waiting for exactly this moment. He personally led his companion cavalry in a devastating charge directly at one of these gaps, aiming once again at Darius's position in the Persian center. The sight of Alexander leading another direct assault on his position was too much for Darius. For the second time, the Persian emperor fled the battlefield, abandoning his army and his imperial regalia. The Persian retreat became a rout as word spread that their king had once again run from the enemy. Alexander's victory was complete, and with it, the Persian Empire effectively ceased to exist as an organized resistance. The aftermath of Gaugamela was as important as the battle itself. Alexander captured the Persian imperial treasury at Babylon, gaining access to wealth beyond imagination. Ancient sources suggest the treasure amounted to over 50,000 talents of gold and silver, enough to fund military operations for decades. But more importantly, Alexander gained control of the administrative apparatus that had governed the Persian Empire for 2 centuries. Alexander's treatment of Babylon demonstrated his evolving approach to governance. Instead of installing Macedonian governors, he retained existing Persian administrators who were willing to serve him. He adopted Persian court ceremonies and began dressing in Persian royal robes for formal occasions. These changes disturbed some of his Macedonian companions, who worried that Alexander was becoming too Persian in his outlook. But Alexander understood something his critics missed. Governing a multi-ethnic empire required different skills than commanding an army. The Persians had successfully administered their vast territories for centuries because they had developed sophisticated systems for dealing with cultural diversity. By adopting and adapting these systems, Alexander was ensuring that his conquests would be stable and productive, rather than simply extracted and abandoned. From Babylon, Alexander moved on to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. This city was the ultimate symbol of Persian power, filled with palaces, temples, and treasuries accumulated over 2 centuries of imperial rule. Alexander's capture of Persepolis was both a practical victory. He gained access to even more treasure, and a symbolic triumph that announced to the world that the Persian Empire was finished. The destruction of Persepolis remains one of the most controversial episodes of Alexander's career. After securing the city's treasures, Alexander ordered the royal palaces burned. Ancient sources disagree about his motivations. Some claim it was revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars over a century earlier. Others suggest it was the result of a drunken party that got out of hand. Still others argue it was a calculated political decision to symbolically mark the end of the old Persian order. Whatever his motivations, the burning of Persepolis had enormous psychological impact throughout the ancient world. Cities and peoples who had served the Persian Empire for generations suddenly found themselves without a master. Some surrendered immediately to Alexander, hoping to gain favorable treatment. Others descended into chaos as local strongmen tried to establish independent kingdoms. The old order was collapsing, and Alexander was the only force capable of creating a new one. But Darius III was still alive and still claiming to be the legitimate Persian emperor. As long as he remained free, Alexander's conquests would remain unstable. Darius had retreated to the eastern provinces of his empire, hoping to raise fresh armies from the peoples of Central Asia and India. Alexander had no choice but to pursue him, even though this meant extending his already long supply lines and marching into territories where no Greek or Macedonian army had ever ventured. The pursuit of Darius took Alexander through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The mountains and deserts of eastern Iran tested his army's endurance to the limit. Supply problems became critical as the distance from friendly territory increased. Many of Alexander's soldiers had been campaigning for over 5 years and were exhausted by constant marching and fighting. Alexander's solution to these challenges revealed his genius for logistics and leadership. He divided his army into multiple columns that could move faster and live off the land more easily than a single large force. He established supply depots at strategic points, often by founding new cities populated by veterans who were too old or too injured for further campaigning. Most importantly, he maintained the morale of his active troops by sharing their hardships and continuing to lead from the front in every engagement. The end of Darius III came not in battle but through betrayal. As Alexander closed in on the fleeing Persian emperor, several of Darius's own satraps murdered him and attempted to negotiate their own terms with Alexander. This assassination robbed Alexander of the chance to capture his great rival alive, but it also eliminated the last symbol of Persian resistance. Alexander's reaction to Darius's death was characteristic of his sophisticated understanding of politics and propaganda. Instead of celebrating the elimination of his enemy, he gave Darius a royal burial and ordered the execution of his assassins. He declared himself the rightful successor to the Persian throne and announced that he would avenge Darius's murder. This response served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Alexander's respect for royal dignity. It legitimized his claim to Persian imperial authority, and it warned other potential rebels that betraying their rulers would not be tolerated. With Darius dead, Alexander might have declared his conquests complete. He controlled territory from Greece to Iran, commanded the largest army in the known world, and possessed treasure beyond calculation. His stated goal of avenging Persian attacks on Greece had been accomplished several times over. Many of his soldiers expected to return home to enjoy their accumulated wealth and glory. But Alexander had no intention of stopping. The eastern provinces of the former Persian Empire had not yet submitted to his authority, and beyond them lay India, a land of legendary wealth and exotic wonders. Alexander's vision had expanded beyond simple conquest to encompass the creation of a truly universal empire that would unite all known peoples under his rule. The campaign in Bactria and Sogdiana, corresponding roughly to modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, proved to be one of Alexander's most difficult challenges. The terrain was mountainous and harsh, the climate was extreme, and the local peoples were experienced in guerrilla warfare tactics that negated many of Alexander's traditional advantages. These were not the organized armies of Greek city-states or Persian satraps. These were tribal confederations led by chieftains who preferred hit-and-run attacks to formal battles. Alexander's response to this challenge demonstrated his adaptability as a military commander. He modified his tactics to deal with guerrilla warfare, using smaller, more mobile units and adopting some of the enemy's own techniques. He established fortified bases throughout the region and gradually extended his control through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. But the Bactrian campaign also revealed growing tensions within Alexander's own forces. Many Macedonian veterans resented fighting in what they saw as worthless territory against enemies they considered barbarians. They had signed up to conquer Persia, not to march endlessly through remote mountains chasing tribal raiders. Some began to question whether Alexander's judgment was being clouded by his apparent belief in his own divinity. These tensions came to a head during a feast at Maracanda, where Alexander killed Clitus the Black, one of his oldest friends and most trusted commanders. Clitus had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, but during the feast he criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his claims of divine parentage. The argument escalated, and Alexander, in a drunken rage, killed Clytus with a spear. Alexander's immediate remorse was genuine and profound. He locked himself in his tent for days, refusing to eat or see anyone. Some sources claim he considered suicide. But the damage to his relationship with his Macedonian officers was severe and lasting. The message was clear: Alexander would tolerate no criticism of his policies or person, even from his closest friends. Despite these internal problems, Alexander continued his eastward advance. His next major challenge was the fortress of the Sogdian Rock, considered absolutely impregnable due to its location on top of a massive cliff. The fortress was held by rebels led by a chieftain named Oxyates, and its capture was essential for securing Alexander's control over the region. Alexander's solution to this seemingly impossible challenge became legendary. He offered rewards to any soldiers who could scale the cliff face and attack the fortress from behind. 300 volunteers attempted the climb, and though 30 were killed by falls, the survivors managed to appear on the heights above the fortress at dawn. The sight of Macedonian soldiers, where none should have been able to go, was so demoralizing to the defenders that they surrendered immediately. The capture of the Sogdian Rock had an unexpected personal consequence for Alexander. Among the prisoners was Roxana, the daughter of Oxyates, and reportedly one of the most beautiful women in Asia. Alexander fell in love with her and married her, cementing a political alliance with her father while also satisfying his personal desires. This marriage further demonstrated Alexander's strategy of incorporating local elites into his imperial system. With Bactria and Sogdiana pacified, Alexander could finally turn his attention to his ultimate goal, the conquest of India. This was to be the culmination of his career, the achievement that would establish him as the greatest conqueror in history. But India presented challenges unlike anything Alexander had faced before. The distances were vast, the climate was alien to Mediterranean peoples, and the military capabilities of Indian kingdoms remained largely unknown. Alexander's invasion of India began in 326 BCE with his army crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains, one of the most formidable natural barriers on Earth. The crossing took weeks and cost the lives of many soldiers due to altitude sickness, cold, and the sheer physical demands of moving an army through mountain passes over 12,000 feet high. But Alexander's personal example continued to inspire his troops. He shared their hardships, walking when his horse died, and carrying wounded soldiers when they could no longer march. The first major Indian kingdom Alexander encountered was ruled by Ambi, king of Taxila. Ambi had been following Alexander's progress and decided that submission was preferable to destruction. He welcomed Alexander with gifts and tribute, providing valuable intelligence about the lands beyond his kingdom. Most importantly, Ambi warned Alexander about his greatest challenge yet, King Porus of the Pauravas, who ruled territory beyond the Hydaspes River and commanded the largest army Alexander had yet faced. Porus was everything previous enemies had not been. He was an experienced military commander, he knew his own territory intimately, and he had access to weapons Alexander had never encountered. War elephants. These massive animals could break up cavalry charges, terrify horses, and trample infantry formations. Porus had over 200 elephants in his army, along with 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 300 war chariots. The Battle of the Hydaspes became Alexander's greatest tactical masterpiece. Faced with an enemy army positioned on the opposite side of a river, with elephants that could devastate his forces if he attempted a direct assault, Alexander devised the most complex battle plan of his career. He divided his army into 3 groups. one to remain at his main camp and make demonstrations to convince Porus that the main attack would come there, another to cross the river upstream at night, and a third to support whichever crossing succeeded. The night crossing was a logistical marvel. Alexander moved 11,000 men, including cavalry and their horses, across a rain-swollen river in darkness without alerting enemy sentries. When dawn broke, Porus found himself facing attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Alexander's previous experience. The war elephants initially created chaos in the Macedonian ranks, trampling soldiers and terrifying horses. But Alexander had prepared his men for this encounter. His archers targeted the elephant drivers, while his infantry used their long sarissas to wound the animals and force them to retreat. Gradually, the elephants became more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy, as wounded and panicked animals trampled Indian soldiers indiscriminately. Alexander's personal combat at the Hydaspes was legendary even by his own standards. He fought in the front ranks for hours, his armor dented and bloodied, his horse killed beneath him. When victory finally came, it was complete but costly. Alexander had defeated the largest army he would ever face, but his own casualties were severe, and many of his veteran officers were dead or wounded. The aftermath of the Hydaspes revealed Alexander at his most magnanimous. Porus, wounded but defiant in defeat, was brought before the Macedonian king. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander was so impressed by this response that he not only restored Porus to his throne, but expanded his territory and made him an ally rather than a subject. This decision demonstrated Alexander's understanding that ruling India would require Indian partners who commanded local respect. But the victory at the Hydaspes also marked the beginning of the end of Alexander's conquests. His army, exhausted by years of campaigning in increasingly alien territory, began to show signs of serious unrest. The Indian climate was devastating to men accustomed to Mediterranean weather. Diseases unknown in Europe decimated the ranks. The monsoon rains turned roads into swamps and made movement nearly impossible for months at a time. More troubling still were reports of what lay ahead. Beyond the Hydaspes were more kingdoms, more rivers, and according to local informants, an ocean that marked the eastern edge of the world. But there were also rumors of vast armies equipped with thousands of war elephants, of kingdoms that could field hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Even Alexander's veterans, who had followed him across 3 continents, began to question whether conquest of the entire world was possible or even desirable. The crisis came at the Hyphasis River, the modern-day Beas in Punjab. Alexander announced his intention to cross this river and continue eastward toward the Ganges and the kingdoms beyond. For the first time in his career, his army refused to follow him. The refusal wasn't mutinous or disrespectful. It was the desperate plea of exhausted men who had given everything they had and could give no more. Conus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, spoke for the army. He reminded Alexander that they had been campaigning for 8 years, that few of the original soldiers remained alive, and that those who survived were worn out by constant warfare in increasingly difficult conditions. He pointed out that Alexander had already achieved immortal glory and conquered more territory than any man in history. Why risk everything for lands that might not even exist? Alexander's response revealed the full extent of his ambition and the isolation that his success had created. He argued that they were on the verge of reaching the Eastern Ocean, that turning back now would leave their conquests incomplete and vulnerable. He spoke of the glory that awaited them and the shame of abandoning their mission when victory was within reach. But for the first time, his words failed to inspire his soldiers. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, hoping that his officers would change their minds. He offered sacrifices to the gods, seeking omens that might convince his men to continue. But the army remained adamant, and eventually Alexander was forced to accept the inevitable. He announced that the gods had spoken against further advance and ordered the construction of 12 massive altars to mark the easternmost point of his conquests. The decision to turn back was one of the most difficult of Alexander's life, but it also demonstrated his practical wisdom. A mutinous army was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous. By accepting his soldiers' limitations, Alexander preserved their loyalty and ensured that his existing conquests could be held and consolidated. But Alexander wasn't ready to simply retrace his steps to Babylon. Instead, he planned an epic journey down the Indus River to the Arabian Sea, then west along the coast to the Persian Gulf. This route would allow him to explore new territories, establish naval bases for future operations, and demonstrate that his empire had secure access to the sea routes that carried much of the world's trade. The journey down the Indus was a campaign in itself. Alexander had to fight numerous battles against Indian tribes who had not submitted to his authority. The most serious of these engagements occurred at the city of the Mali, where Alexander was severely wounded while leading an assault on the city walls. An arrow pierced his lung, and his soldiers, seeing their king fall, went berserk with fury and massacred the entire population of the city. Alexander's wound at the Mali city was nearly fatal. He lost enormous amounts of blood and developed a high fever that lasted for days. Rumors spread throughout the army that he was dead, leading to panic and near mutiny among soldiers who couldn't imagine continuing without their legendary leader. When Alexander finally recovered enough to show himself to his troops, the relief was overwhelming. But the incident reminded everyone, including Alexander himself, of his mortality. The exploration of the Indus Delta and the Arabian Sea was a remarkable achievement in its own right. Alexander's admiral, Granicus, led a fleet of specially constructed ships down the river and along the coast, mapping territories that had never been explored by Greeks. Meanwhile, Alexander led the main army along the coast, establishing supply depots and fighting off attacks by local tribes. But the most challenging part of the journey was still ahead: the crossing of the Gadrosian Desert in modern-day Pakistan and Iran. This wasteland was one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with scorching temperatures during the day, freezing cold at night, and virtually no water or food. Alexander chose this route partly because no army had ever successfully crossed the desert, and he wanted to surpass the legendary achievements of Cyrus the Great and Semiramis. The desert crossing was a disaster that nearly destroyed Alexander's army. Of the approximately 85,000 people who entered the desert, soldiers, camp followers, and support personnel, only about 25,000 survived. The rest died of thirst, heat stroke, exhaustion, or attacks by desert nomads. Alexander himself suffered alongside his men, refusing the small amounts of water his bodyguards tried to save for him, and sharing in all the hardships of the march. The crossing of the Gadrosian Desert was perhaps Alexander's greatest failure as a military commander, but it also demonstrated his extraordinary leadership. A lesser commander would have lost control of his forces entirely, leading to complete dissolution of the army. Alexander's personal example and unwavering determination held the survivors together and eventually brought them to safety in Carmania. When Alexander finally reached Babylon in 324 BCE, he found his empire in serious trouble. Many of his governors, believing he was dead in India, had begun acting as independent rulers. Some had raised private armies, others had looted their provinces' treasuries, and several had declared themselves kings. The administrative system Alexander had worked so hard to establish was collapsing due to his prolonged absence. Alexander's response was swift and ruthless. He executed the worst offenders, replaced unreliable governors with trusted subordinates, and implemented new oversight systems to prevent future rebellions. But he also recognized that the problems went deeper than individual corruption. His empire was simply too large to be governed effectively by a single person using ancient communication and transportation methods. Alexander's solution was characteristically ambitious. He would create a new kind of empire based on cultural fusion rather than military domination. He began implementing policies designed to blend Greek, Persian, and other cultures into a unified imperial civilization. He ordered mass marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen. He recruited Persian soldiers into his army and began training them in Macedonian tactics. He adopted more Persian customs and required his courtiers to follow Persian court protocols. These policies created enormous tension with Alexander's original Macedonian and Greek followers. Many viewed the cultural fusion policies as betrayal of their Greek heritage and a sign that Alexander had become too influenced by Eastern luxury and despotism. The situation became so tense that some Macedonian veterans staged a near mutiny at Opis, refusing to accept discharge bonuses because they included Persian soldiers in the ceremony. Alexander's response to the Opis mutiny was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Instead of punishing the mutineers, he dismissed them from service and announced that he would complete his future conquests, using Persian troops alone. The threat of being replaced by their former enemies was so terrifying to the Macedonian veterans that they immediately begged for forgiveness and reinstatement. But Alexander's health was beginning to fail under the enormous stresses of ruling a world empire. The wounds he had accumulated over 15 years of constant warfare had taken their toll. The arrow wound from the Mali city had never properly healed, causing chronic pain and breathing difficulties. The desert crossing had damaged his constitution permanently. More troubling still were signs of increasing paranoia and erratic behavior that suggested psychological strain. In early 323 BCE, while planning new campaigns against Arabia and possibly the Western Mediterranean, Alexander fell seriously ill in Babylon. The exact nature of his illness remains debated by historians and medical experts. Some suggest malaria, others point to typhoid fever, and still others argue for poisoning by political enemies. What's certain is that the illness progressed rapidly and that Alexander's doctors were helpless to treat it. As Alexander lay dying, his generals and administrators gathered around his bedbed, desperate to know who would succeed him. The empire he had created was held together primarily by his personal authority and charisma. Without clear succession plans, it seemed likely to fragment immediately upon his death. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, Alexander reportedly whispered, "To the strongest," though some sources claim he was too weak to speak at all. Alexander died in Babylon on June 10th, 323 BCE, just 1 month before his 33rd birthday. In less than 13 years of active campaigning, he had conquered territory stretching from Greece to India, founded over 20 cities, and created the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His achievements were so extraordinary that many people refused to believe he had died of natural causes. Surely only treachery could have brought down such a legendary figure. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death proved his fears about succession to be justified. His empire immediately began fragmenting as his generals, known as the diadochi or successors, fought each other for control of different regions. The wars of succession would continue for over 40 years, ultimately resulting in the division of Alexander's empire into several kingdoms ruled by Macedonian dynasties. But Alexander's impact on world history extended far beyond his military conquests. His policy of cultural fusion created a new civilization known as Hellenism, which blended Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian elements into a cosmopolitan culture that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia for centuries. The cities he founded, particularly Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning and commerce that preserved and transmitted ancient knowledge through the Middle Ages. Alexander's military innovations revolutionized warfare for centuries to come. His use of combined arms tactics, professional logistics systems, and rapid strategic movement became standard practice for successful commanders throughout antiquity. The Roman legions that later conquered the Mediterranean world were directly descended from Macedonian military innovations. Perhaps most importantly, Alexander's conquests created the first truly global economy in human history. His empire connected trade routes from Spain to China, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. The cultural and economic networks he established survived the political fragmentation of his empire and continued to shape world development for over a millennium. The psychological impact of Alexander's achievements was equally profound. He had demonstrated that determined leadership could overcome apparently impossible obstacles, that traditional boundaries between peoples and cultures could be transcended, and that individual human beings could literally change the course of world history. These lessons inspired countless later conquerors, from the Roman emperors to Napoleon Bonaparte. But Alexander's story also contains cautionary lessons about the costs of unlimited ambition. His relentless drive for conquest destroyed countless lives, obliterated entire cultures, and ultimately consumed his own health and sanity. The empire he created was too large to be effectively governed and collapsed immediately upon his death. His personal relationships were sacrificed to his political goals, and his final years were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. Modern historians continue to debate Alexander's legacy. Was he a visionary leader who created the first global civilization, or was he a destructive conqueror whose achievements were built on unprecedented violence? Was his policy of cultural fusion a genuine attempt to create a better world? Or was it merely a practical response to the administrative challenges of governing diverse populations? What's undeniable is that Alexander's life represents one of the most extraordinary examples of human achievement in recorded history. In an age when most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, he led armies across 3 continents. In a world divided by seemingly insurmountable cultural and linguistic barriers, he created a unified empire that connected peoples from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In a time when individual human beings seemed powerless against the forces of nature and society, he demonstrated that exceptional individuals could literally reshape the world. Alexander's methods were often brutal by modern standards, but they were typical of his time, and his achievements transcended the limitations of his era. He created new possibilities for human civilization that influenced the development of art, literature, philosophy, science, and politics for centuries to come. The universities, libraries, and research institutions that he founded preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of multiple civilizations. The cities Alexander established became melting pots where different cultures could interact and learn from each other. The Greek language became a universal medium of communication, across his former empire, facilitating trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange. The fusion of Greek rational thinking with Eastern mysticism and practical knowledge created new forms of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Alexander's influence on military thinking extended far beyond ancient times. His emphasis on speed, flexibility, and personal leadership became fundamental principles of successful military command. His understanding of logistics, intelligence gathering, and combined arms tactics influenced military theorists from Clausewitz to modern special forces commanders. But perhaps Alexander's most enduring legacy was the idea that human potential is virtually unlimited when combined with determination, intelligence, and exceptional leadership. He demonstrated that traditional assumptions about what is possible can be shattered by individuals willing to risk everything for their vision. This lesson has inspired not just military leaders, but also explorers, scientists, artists, and reformers throughout history. Alexander's story reminds us that the course of human history is not predetermined by economic forces or geographical constraints, but can be dramatically altered by exceptional individuals who refuse to accept the limitations others consider permanent. In just 13 years, a young man from a minor kingdom transformed the entire known world and created possibilities that shaped human development for millennia. As we face our own global challenges in the 21st century, Alexander's example offers both inspiration and warning. His achievements demonstrate what determined leadership can accomplish when backed by clear vision and unlimited commitment. But his ultimate failure to create stable institutions that could survive his death reminds us that lasting change requires more than individual brilliance. It requires systems and structures that can transcend any single person's lifetime. Alexander the Great died at 32, but his impact on human civilization continues to this day. The world he created, interconnected, multicultural, and driven by the belief that human beings can overcome any obstacle, is recognizably the ancestor of our own global civilization. In that sense, Alexander's greatest conquest was not any territory or empire, but the expansion of human imagination about what is possible when extraordinary individuals dare to dream of changing the world.